Uh, my name is Bahiyyah. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is the 10th of January, 1985. I have a home group, the Atascocita group of Humble, Texas, and I have a sponsor. And I sponsor people. Um, I always get a little bit nervous, and I'm particularly, for some reason, a bit emotional today, which is not an emotion that I cherish. Okay. Uh, but for me, there's always a responsibility to demonstrate and to be a good demonstration of those people that paved the way before me. People like Joe and Charlie and my sponsor at the time, Willie B, and a whole slew of other people, including Glenn, including, a bunch of guys from Long Island and here in Texas. So uh, I'm going to share what it was like for me, what happened, and what it is like for me today. Uh, if I stumble, if I'm offensive or anything, that is all on me. If I happen to say anything that is of value to you, then I ask you to give thanks to your higher power as you understand him, because it would be that power that speaks, not me. I grew up in Nebraska in a small farming community. I was raised by my paternal grandparents, who were very kind, hardworking individuals, a town of 400 people. My biological mother had left when I was 18 months old, and my father was killed in an automobile accident when I was 6. So uh, that certainly put me in a situation where I was different than most people in the small farming community I grew up in. I know for certain my first drink was when I was 5, uh, Thanksgiving, Mogan David Y. uh, but back then, it was not abnormal uh, for like my father anyway to, put a little alcohol and some soda and give it to children. Um, but I didn't start drinking really consciously on my own till I was in junior high. And and I did that because I had a lot of emotional pain and it hurt. Uh, I just remembered that feelings hurt. And I had a hole inside my gut or soul, and I didn't know what to do. I had, my grandmother had sent me to church that didn't seem to fulfill anything for me. I was pretty judgmental. My dad, this town had 2 bars in it, and one of the bars, Buzzy's, uh, was kind of where he was a lot. Uh, so that was my home away from home. I felt comfortable and secure when I was in that bar. Uh, and of course, at that time in society in that town, it it was not. I was allowed as a small kid in the bar, and those church people would come in the back door and buy a bottle to take. Uh, but on Sundays they would act holier than thou, so I became very judgmental about that. Um, I started going to we had 2 churches, 2 bars, right? So the one church that we went to, my sister and I would say that we were going to the youth services on Sunday, and instead we would meet some people and go drink. There were always adults in the area that were willing to buy alcohol for minors. Uh, began smoking when I was about uh, 13, and I began smoking because I was trying to pass to be older, right? Sitting in a bar in a neighboring town, I needed to light a cigarette so they would think I was 21, which was the drinking age at the time. I had frosted my hair. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but it's like streaks of gray, like so I could look older. And I took a big drag off the cigarette and started coughing, so I had to leave the bar because I knew they would know I was a liar. And life for me just didn't hold out any hopes. I felt less than my uh, in the economic, social economic, we were poor, uh, but we always had food on the table. Uh, I learned early on that I was also different, that that could get some sympathy when I had a job in the local little beauty shop and I overheard the owner uh, tell some other client about the poor little girl who had lost her father and her mom had left. Um, so I could see that that could be used to my advantage. Uh, my grandfather, I never saw them drink, but I did find a pint of whiskey in his closet. Um, so I can't blame any of that on them. I ran about a 50, 75-mile radius, uh, running and drinking, and uh, I procured a a reputation that didn't suit me because all I was doing was drinking. Uh, I just wanted oblivion. I wanted oblivion from the very beginning. And I wanted to escape this little town where everybody thought they knew everything about you. And I didn't think they knew anything about me. They certainly didn't know some of the emotional pain. And my grandparents, bless their hearts, they would try and they would go look for me. And when it got so people had to drop me off blocks away from my house because my grandpa stood underneath the yard light in his long john underwear with a rifle, and sort of detours people from wanting to date you a little bit. But in any case, so I wanted to get away, and somebody suggested that I could maybe be a model. And so I thought, well, okay, these people came around from the big city of Omaha to try to get people to go to this finishing school, and so my grandparents would have done anything I asked. Uh, they tried so hard. I know their heart was broken because my father was their only child, and so when he died, that was heartbreaking for them. And the cops in town, the state patrolman would threaten to send me to a girls' school when my grandparents were out looking for me. And I would use that as guilt on my grandparents about what would happen to young girls when they go to those kinds of facilities. So they never did. So we went, they signed the papers. I went away to this school in Omaha, which was really a big ripoff, but uh, it was a career college and finishing school. So they piled a bunch of women into a one bedroom, two bedroom dorm, like 6 to 8 people. And but I continued to drink, and I found, of course, a few people that drank. And it was the first time in my life I ever was grounded. The doors were locked at a certain hour, and you had to sign to go out and in. And that didn't suit me. So there was a few of us that were a bit rebellious, and we got busted for having alcohol and stuff in the dorm. And of course, they all confessed and I lied because I had this kind of Jimmy Dean thing from watching TV, I guess, uh, about you don't rat. So they they were trying to kick me out of school, but I refused to leave, and I holed up in the dorm, and the ladies helped me take a collection of pop bottles, and I hired a lawyer, and I didn't have to go. Uh, but one of the teachers there told me that I just needed some direction. And I didn't even understand what she meant by that. But that finished that little school, and me and my roommate, we moved to Kansas City because she was from Kansas, and I didn't have anything else to do. I had no goals. I had no hope of things being different than I was just supposed to survive from one drink to the next, and it would just be repeated time after time after time. Um, Kansas City, I ended up being there. I can't even tell you how long I was there. Some salesman who tried to sell us some dishes ended up getting me a job because I said I couldn't buy the dishes because I didn't have a job. The job happened to be with some little uh, people that were wanted by the FBI, a company called Club America, and so that didn't work. And I was just really rebellious. I was always in these people's faces and challenging them, kind of like an idiot. And I went to all kinds of sordid places. I've had guns held to my head, but I was never afraid. I didn't care. I just didn't care. Um, and I was just in a lot of, now I know, like emotional pain. But again, that was just life. You just survived. And my grandfather got ill. I ended up in Arizona, and then I hitchhiked back to Colorado, and he ended up dying. And I was filled with guilt because instead of going to the hospital back to Nebraska, I, had plans for some drinking binge thing I was going to do. And I mean, he would have been okay with it because he used to always say he came into the world alone. He was going to go out alone. But I had guilt and remorse, but I just continued to drink. Um, Shortly thereafter, my grandmother got ill. Uh, I went back home for that. And that's really the only time I stopped drinking. After she died, uh, I didn't drink for about 30 days because I was afraid that I would just totally lose it. See, I thought I might be crazy, but I didn't want you to know that. And I was kind of okay if I was locked up in an institution. I had a great uncle that was. Um, and the idea of sitting on a rocking chair on a porch and weaving baskets and stuff, that was actually rather appealing to me. Uh, the thing that wasn't appealing is that you couldn't leave. So, that's that. That about 30 days, my sister and I stayed back in Nebraska to take care of, the house and all of that stuff to sell. And I was afraid that I would just totally fall apart. But soon afterwards, began drinking again. Um, Other mind-changing things came into my life because I was losing control over both bladder and I was always getting sick. I couldn't keep anything down. And so some of that other stuff balanced it out. I might puke on you. I might puke in your closet. Uh, my biggest fear came true one day where I woke up in a bed full of vomit. And that scared me because the little town drunk had died that way. So I was really scared, and I dragged the mattress outside on the fire escape because I lived on the top floor. And then I went and got a beer to get the taste out of my mouth. And so that fear didn't last long. Um, I worked at a youth center, and these guys that I worked with in Denver, in the ghetto area, had converted to Islam, and they were trying to talk to me about that. And they gave me a Quran. And one day out of destitution, I read it, and something touched my heart because the term Islam means if you submit your will to the will of your creator, there is a sense of peace and serenity that will be achieved. That was desirable, but I didn't exactly know how to do that. So, I covered myself in typical uh, Islamic attire from head to toe. and went about trying to be that, whatever I just went through some of the motions. But just like in Christianity, there were people in that faith that say one thing and do another. So I became disheartened. And, um, and so it was those people again. And I kept trying to force myself uh, to be something that I didn't feel in my heart. Uh, I became more destitute. One of the women I had met at the masjid in Denver had converted. And then she changed. And anyway, we were running around. We were known as the Muslim party girls because we were still smoking pot at the time. And she moved to Florida. So I would go to Florida. By then I had a great job. I had got hired on with an airline by some miracle so I could fly. So I would go down and see her in Florida, and we would drink. I would take a few Quaaludes to kind of help because that's similar to being drunk. And on one of my trips, the routine is I would I would drink whatever before I got on the plane. I would drink on the plane. I would get there. She would have alcohol and some other stuff. And one time I got there and she didn't have anything because she was now going to something called AA. And I was a little bit familiar with that because the sister that I had, she was like insane. She would get drunk and chase me with a butcher knife and all kinds of weird shit. And I had called the cops and had her locked up for a while. And I went to see her and watch some weird tape from a Father Martin. And I watched these people, going through DTs around me. And I thought, poor them, but that's not me. And then it became me. So I'm in Florida, and my friend is telling me that she's not drinking or anything anymore. And I say, well, that's interesting, but let's go to the liquor store. So she takes me, and I sit on the floor and drink, and she tells me about Alcoholics Anonymous. And she hadn't been around that long because she didn't see that part about only you can determine whether you're an alcoholic or not. And so she told me I was an alcoholic, and she was going to go to a meeting, and she invited me to go. It was an open meeting. I remember that, but I think it was an open meeting, actually. What I do remember is if they called on me, I was supposed to say that I was an alcoholic. And that was not a problem. I was used to lying. I would tell you whatever I needed to tell you. So we went. The only thing I remember is that it was huge, huge, huge. And afterwards, they made a circle and they began to say the Lord's Prayer, and I ran out of the room. I was scared. And I came back to Texas, and I thought about it. And I would stare at the bottle on the shelf, and it was sort of like a staring contest, who would win, and I would give up. Um, And one day at the swimming pool, I met a lady who'd been going to AA, and she was going to go back in the fall. So I said, well, hey, when you go back, maybe I'll go with you. Um, so in the meantime, during that summer, one of my nephews comes to live with me because him and his mom can't seem to get along. And I'm drinking, and I'm waiting for him to go to sleep, and I'm leaving the apartment to go to some other people's apartments, and he's waking up, and it's really not a very comfortable feeling. So I have to send him away. And then the fall comes, and this lady starts going to AA. And so, we drink a few beers and we go to the meeting, and I sit there, and a bunch of weird old geezers kind of reminded me of a bunch of farmers. And I was very cool. I wore sarongs. I was cosmopolitan. And so I wanted you to believe. And and so I sat in these meetings, and I didn't, and they talked about, well, in my program this and my program that. And I thought, okay, so they're going to hand me like a little horoscope printout, and I'll have my program. Uh, So I just kept going. That didn't happen. And so one day, this couple would pick me up and take me because I didn't have a car. And this lady, her name was Gloria, and she looked like a vampire. She was an Al-Anon, so of course she looked like a vampire. And no offense, but she had like long teeth, and she made her husband carry her purse and stuff. And Leonard was such a good old nice guy. But anyway, Gloria asked me how long I'd been sober, so I made up a day because, what did I care about what she thought? Um, and she would make me wipe down tables and stuff at the group. But I got to thinking, and I would hear them say, just try it. You can always go back. The problem's at the top of the bottle, not the bottom of the bottle. All this weird stuff that didn't even make sense to me. What are you talking about? They would talk about you have to change 360 degrees. And I thought, oh, these poor old people, they don't know that 360 degrees takes you back to where you are. So one day I went to a women's meeting. I don't like women, right? So can't trust them. They're conniving. So I go to this women's meeting, and back then they used to say you had to have an honest desire to stop drinking. And as they went to hand out chips, at that moment, I had as honest of a desire was possible. And I accepted the chip, knowing that if it was a lie, I didn't care because I didn't care about these people anyway. And the women, I just didn't fit in there. First, it was kind of a more high, economic higher place than what I was used to hanging out. And then they just talked about their kids and their husbands, and I didn't have any kids except for my nephew that I borrowed and sent back. And I didn't have a husband except for some that belonged to some other women out in society, and I gave those back too. So, but I took the chip, and I just went to discussion meetings. And then one trip down to Florida, because I was always running back to Florida. And I remember I met some guy, he had 40 years. And I thought, why? Why would you stay sober 40 years? That's like insane. And they kept saying, you're going to have to stay put in Texas and get a sponsor in Texas. But then one day I saw this little advertisement, and it was kind of like, it looked like it would be, those, no, I can't remember what they're called. Like when you go to college and you get those little books, like you can learn something in like no time. It'd be kind of like now AA for dummies or some shit, right? So it's just like a bunch of questions. And I knew that if I knew the answers, I could come back. And so the goal is for me to get you to believe that I know what I'm talking about. And I'm smart. I'm elevated. I got this whole thing down. So I go. It turns out to be a big book somewhere. And I meet these men, Joe and Charlie, Joe McHugh from Little Rock and Charlie from Maysville. And then there was this weird lady from Texas who kind of looked like Lily Tomlin, except she had blonde or silver hair, depending on who you ask, but she had the horn-rimmed glasses, and she was kind of freaky, and it was interesting. But I listened, and those men talked about, they didn't really talk about too much new that I hadn't heard in those meetings, but I actually heard it this time about the disease, the physical allergy, the mental obsession. They talked about the miracle of Roland Hazard and Carl Jung and Dr. Silkworth and the Oxford group. And I became intrigued and interested. And it sort of made sense to me. They, had this restless, irritable discontent, sort of like a wheel for a gerbil or something, hamster. Uh, and I started to begin to understand why, when I thought I was only going to have a couple, I never ever did. And then I was always restless, irritable, discontent, full of remorse, guilt, shame, And then what would I do? I'd pick up a drink again. I heard somebody say once in a meeting that, you go to a doctor and the doctor tells you that if you continue drinking, you're going to die. And so you get scared. And what do you do when you're scared? You drink. You go to a psychiatrist and they tell you if you don't stop drinking, you're going to end up in a nut ward, and that scares you. So what do? You drink. You go to a person of, um, the cloth, and they tell you you're going to go to hell. And so you're scared. And so what do? You drink. So all of that began to make sense to me. And I came back to Texas and thought about it. And I went back the following year, and I kept looking at this weird lady. Her name turned out to be Willie B. She did the 12 and 12 with some other people. And so I go back again, and now this time, I have to, again, be important. You understand that, right? So I talked to this guy, Joe, and I asked to do my third step with Joe. And he's kind. And so we sit outside, and he smokes his pipe, and he talks about this is a decision you have to make from your heart. And not really the heart that's in your chest, which is a muscle, but the heart which is at the center of your mind, as in the heart of a watermelon. Now, I will tell you, it took me probably 2 or 3 years to understand what the hell he was talking about, because it was all really Greek to me. But I did that, and then I talked to him. He said I needed to get a sponsor, and he suggested this lady, Willie, who was from Texas, near where I was living. And she was a little intimidating. So we get back, and I did get her number. And I called her, and I explained to her where I was going to meetings and how all of these people were wrong about what they were doing. And she was kind. And then it was, oh, honey. And she talked about the weather. She didn't seem to get the memo that she was supposed to volunteer to be my sponsor. And so she didn't volunteer. So some time goes, I asked a lady at my home group to be my sponsor. Now I've got in my head how the outline of how it's done in the book, listing the resentments and what happened. And the lady that I asked to be my sponsor, she was used to doing kind of a write your whole life story. And I couldn't even begin to start. So I followed the instructions that I understood from the workshop. And I went to her, and she didn't quite understand. She was bored. We finished. I did not take the hour to rest. I went to work. I called her. I'm like, I can't do this. She suggested that I burn my 4th step. So I did that, but I was restless, irritable, unsettled. I tried talking to her. Then we had other differences about some of the men in the group. They were being accused of 13 stepping, but the truth was when a woman would walk in, none of the women would speak to her or reach out. So sometimes one of the older men would. So in my mind, we were to blame for not reaching out. But anyway, the sponsor and I, we just sort of went our own ways. And I went without a sponsor for a couple of years. And I went back down to the seminar. Well, actually, I when I went to Florida one other time, this guy that had 40 years at the time, I thought I'd ask him to help me. And so he had me come home and write about the deadly sins out of the 12 and 12. And then when I was done, to get back with him. So I did that. And so I go back down to Florida, and we go to lunch, and then we go to his house to go over what I had written. And he went in his room to change and come back out in a pair of underwear and wanted me to sit on his lap. And I freaked out. Came off the street, been down this road. I just totally freaked out. And so graciously, he was like surprised that I was freaking out for some reason. So, but anyway, he took me back to my hotel. I didn't drink. He didn't drink. I saw him years later at a big book seminar. Um, but again, I was disillusioned. Uh, I was disillusioned by people. I met one of the old guys in my group. We used to always go to Denny's, and one day he was drunker than Cooter Brown, and that scared me. And he said to me that it wasn't the program that failed, it was him. So I think at that point, my reliance began a shift from people to something that was in the program. Uh, so another trip to Florida, and I'm talking to a lady uh, about, how all these people just keep failing. And she suggested that I ask Willie to be my sponsor. So we're all on the same plane coming back to Houston, and I have a plan. My seat is a few rows up from Willie's. So my plan is I'm going to go back. I'm going to ask her. She's going to say no because she's not real like so many people. And then I'm going to stay in my seat and I'm going to glare at her when she deplanes, and then I'm going to talk shit about her later. That's my plan. So I go back and I ask her, and I know she wasn't drinking, but she must have had a retarded moment because she said, "Oh, honey, I'd love to." I'm like, oh, just ruined my plan. So she became my sponsor, and she was my sponsor for 20 plus years. Um, a lot of people where I got sober at, it was sort of a social deal, and they would invite you over to their house, and you would do all these social things together. And Willie uh, did not invite me over to her house initially. And she told me uh, that I could not call her between 11 and 2, nor could I call her between 5 and 7 unless I was about to take a drink. Uh, but other than that, if I thought I needed to talk to her, that I needed to get on my knees and ask God to direct my thinking, and then call her after those times. She set boundaries. She spent time with her husband. And she had balance in her life. And when she did allow me to come over to her house, I was like kind of freaked out about it. And I was pregnant with my daughter at the time. Uh, but we would meet weekly at Luby's, and we would talk. And that relationship grew so deep. It's a relationship I am so very grateful for. Her and I are people that normally would not have mixed. Um, she was a very conservative Texas woman. I'm an old hippie, independent, uh, street kind of gal. And sometimes we had differences, strong differences of opinion. Uh, but what I learned was that instead of cutting and running like I'd done all my life, I stayed the course and would continue to reach out. And and she became like a granddaughter to my daughter. Uh, we were included as a member of her family. I had the honor of taking care of her, uh, not really taking care, looking after her the last few days. She did have in-home care, but by golly, those people had to answer to me, and a couple of them we didn't agree on some things, and they would call her son who lived about 5 hours away, and he would say, well, you need to work it out because if anybody goes, it's going to be you, but he stays. So it was such an honor, and her family continues, her son continues to allow me to be a part of her life, of their lives and her grandkids. So in all of that, my heart began to change, and I began to try to establish a relationship with a higher power that I could trust. Uh, because trust is not something that comes easy for me. And it still is something I somewhat struggle with from time to time. But, the whole thing is a process. The book talks about we practice and we came, and there's no time frame on that. I want my relationship with my creator to come from inside my heart instead of me trying to put myself in a square or a round hole or whatever, but it's got to come from my heart. So I, s- uh, I appreciated the fourth step and continue to do that to find out the exact nature of my wrong and where I'm being selfish and inconsiderate and full of fear. And, um, and to redirect those basic instincts where they're in balance and in proportion. And I'm striving uh, over the last year pretty hard to have the only thing that occupies my heart is uh, is my creator. Uh, that when I look at something or experience a feeling in a relationship, to recognize that the source of that is my creator. And that's where the awe, the appreciation, uh, the glory goes to the source and not the created. I struggled a little bit when I think about emotional sobriety and having only God being in the center of my heart and not to have, uh, and my daughter's my only child. And so that's been interesting, but she's God's child. She's not my child. I have the honor to have had the opportunity to try to be a mother. And sometimes I've done okay. And sometimes I've not done okay. When she was an infant, a lot of times I would, so focused on working with others and helping others that sometimes uh, she suffered. And as women, and I think probably even as men, but certainly as women, when we're mothers and we're daughters and maybe wives, you know, we can't hide out in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. We have to put what we learn into practice because knowledge without application is of no value at all, no real value at all. So uh, that's my attempt is to put the things that I've learned inside the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, the things that I've learned, especially inside our textbooks, the things that I've learned from the people that have walked before and walked beside, and people who come up even behind. Um, it's the quality, it's the focus of our sobriety. I don't go to discussion meetings, maybe once, I don't know, every 6 months or something. I'm not a big discussion meeting person because I don't care about anybody's opinion. And that's a lot of times what we get. I'll go if people are going to, if I find that they're sharing their experience. Um, but a lot of times we end up just sharing, you know, giving our opinion. And opinions and something else. Everybody has one, right? Um, I I'm humbled today to have the opportunity to share. I do a lot of service work today in the corrections, and I enjoy that. I've been asked sometimes by inmates why, and it's a very good question. Um, and I think a couple reasons. One, there's the old thing, the I in you is the I in me. When we look at each other eyeball to eyeball, I see a reflection of myself. The program teaches me if, I spot it in you, that means I've got it. So we're a reflection of each other. I'm grateful that I didn't yet have to do any time behind bars. Um, and those women and men, every now and then, there'll be one that is just so honest and open and so dedicated uh, in the application of our steps, of our traditions. Uh, some of these men will never get out. Uh, and some of the women tend to get out within a few years. The men are the ones that tend to do life. And then, and I've had the privilege of working with those being, sharing two ways with people on death row. Uh, and people have said, why death row? They're going to die. Well, I want to die with a clear heart, and everyone deserves that same thing. Plus, they're really good at spotting BS and calling me on my BS, and I get to call them on theirs. So um, it's a beautiful thing. I got a deal the other day from somebody. Uh, I'm going to see if I can find it real quick. That's just real short. That says, our task is not to seek love, but merely seek and find all the barriers within ourselves that you have built against it. And and that still remains my challenge today, because I have a lot of barriers. Uh, Thanksgiving is difficult for me. I think because my grandfather died around this time. There's just a bunch of things that have happened, but it is also a holiday that reminds me to be thankful. Uh, I'm pretty indigenous oriented, so there's some issues with that I struggle with as well. But you know, uh, I think it's Joe and Charlie taught, you can't drink on a lie, and I think that that's absolutely true. Uh, and with an attitude of gratitude, if I'm looking for the things to be grateful for, even if it's just one thing, I can't sit around and feel sorry for myself or anything else. I'm going to read one thing that just means a lot to me, and then I'm going to shut up. This is a poem. It's entitled Drunks, and it's written by a guy named Jack McCarthy, who's dead but was a member. He wrote this in memory of his father, who never made it to the rooms. And if you're interested in a copy, you can just Google it, Drunks, Jack McCarthy, and you can find several. But it says, we died of pneumonia in furnished rooms where they found us 3 days later when somebody complained about the smell. We died against bridge abutments and nobody knew if it was suicide. We probably didn't know either, except in this sense that it was always suicide. We died in hospitals, our stomachs huge, distended, and there was nothing they could do. We died in cells, never knowing whether we were guilty or not. We slashed our wrists so that lifeblood flowed away from us to give us peace at last. We went to priests, they gave us pledges, they told us to pray, they told us to go and sin no more, but go. We tried and we died. We died of overdoses. We died in bed. We died in straitjackets while suffering the DT, seeing God knows what, creeping, skittering, slithering, shuffling things, jumping off the walls, playing that awful music that went on and on. And you know what the worst thing was? The worst thing was that nobody ever believed how hard we tried. We went to doctors and they gave us stuff to take that would make us sick when we drank on the principle it was so crazy it might work. I guess, or maybe they just shook their heads and sent us to places like Dropkick Murphy's, and when we got out, we were hooked on formaldehyde, or maybe we lied to the doctors and they told us not to drink so much. Just try to have a couple of beers, they might have said. Just give it a real try. Just drink like me. And we tried, and we died. We drowned in our own vomit or choked on it, our broken jaws wired shut. We died playing Russian roulette, and people thought we'd lost, but we knew better. We died under the hooves of horses, under the wheels of vehicles, under the knives and boot heels of our brother drunks. We died in shame. And you know what was even worse? Even worse, that we couldn't believe it ourselves that we had tried. We figured we just thought we tried, and we died believing we hadn't tried, believing that we didn't know what it meant to try. When we were desperate enough or hopeful or deluded or embattled enough to go for help, we went to people with letters after their names and prayed they might have read the right books that had the right words in them so they could tell us what to do, never suspecting that the terrifying truth, that the right words, as simple as they were, had not been written yet. They were to come. We died falling off girders on high buildings because, of course, iron workers drink. We died with a shotgun in our mouth or jumping off a bridge, and everybody knew it was suicide. We died under the Southeast Expressway with our hands tied behind us and a bullet in the back of our head, because this time the people that we disappointed were the wrong people. We died in convulsions or of insult to the brain, a wet brain. We died incontinent and in disgrace, abandoned. And when we were women, we died degraded, because women have a much more to live up to. And although we tried, we died and nobody cried. And the very worst thing was that for every one of us that died, there were another 100 of us or another 1,000 who wished they would die. And we went to sleep praying we would never wake up, because what we were enduring was intolerable, and we knew in our hearts it wasn't ever going to change. One day in a hospital room in New York City, one of us had what the book calls a transforming spiritual experience. And he said to himself, I've got it. He hadn't quite got it. I have to share it. He almost had. And he kept trying to give it away, but we couldn't hear it. The transmission line wasn't open yet. We tried to hear it. We tried. We died. We died of one last cigarette, the comfort of its glowing in the dark. We passed out and the bed caught fire. They said we suffocated before our body burned. They said we never felt a thing. That was the best way, maybe, that we died, except sometimes we took our family with us. Still we tried, and we died. And the man in New York was so sure he had it. He tried to love us into sobriety, but that didn't work either. Love confuses drunks. And he tried, and still we died, and one after another, we got his hopes up, and we broke his heart, because that's what we do. And the very worst thing of all was that every time we thought we knew what the worst thing was, something happened that was even worse. Until a day came in a hotel lobby, and it wasn't in Rome or Jerusalem or Mecca or Dublin or even South Boston. It was in Akron, Ohio, when the man said, I have to find a drunk because I need him as much as he needs me. And so it happened that after thousands of years of people trying and dying alone, a solution to our problem was conceived. And now we don't go to men of cloth, to doctors, psychiatrists, and people with letters after their names. We come to people who have been there. We come to each other, and we try. And we don't need to cry, and we don't need to die. And one last thing I'll tell you is that 360 degrees that those old guys said, and I said they didn't know what they were talking about. A couple years ago, I was watching a movie, and Morgan Freeman was in it, and he had this book, As a Man Thinketh, which got my attention because that was an early book that was used in our fellowship. And he drew a circle on the board. And at the top of the circle, he said, here's where your life begins. And we travel around the circle, and we oftentimes get lost. And then we come back to this and get back on the circle, which is what Alcoholics Anonymous did for me, is put me back on the circle. And the circle takes us back to who we are. And all of a sudden I knew those old men weren't so stupid. This program takes us to who we are, who our Creator intended us to be. Thanks for taking time to listen to me today.